I suppose I always ask myself a question before I go to a place, but I'm not seeking an answer. I think the best places are the ones that leave you permanently unsettled.
Well, Pico, it's an incredible pleasure to share a stage with you again. An honor and a pleasure. It's great to see you. So I thought what I'd do tonight to begin, serendipitously enough, I found that someone who's here tonight had this book, The Lady and the Monk, 4 Seasons in Kyoto, which is in many ways Pico's signature book, I think. It's a wonderful, wonderful account of moving to Japan. And it was published in 1991. And this is a very personal book, and your most recent book, The Man Within My Head, is your other most personal book, I believe, that you've written to date, in my opinion. And so you have these 2 very revealing books, and I just thought I'm going to hand this book to you and ask you to hold it in your hand and tell me what you think as you look at that book, what you remember, what you feel about it now. What does it bring out in you?
I love this cover image, which is probably too small for any of you to see, but it catches the Japan that I dreamed of. You know, Japan, and I think this applies to you, was my home before I ever went there. When I was a little boy, I would look at Japanese paintings, I would read Japanese poems, and something made me feel as if I recognized that place better than the town where I was born, Oxford, England, or the place where I kept all my stuff, Santa Barbara, California. Just images from Japan would pierce me with a kind of familiarity. And I think all of us have these secret homes. Often it might be India or Egypt or China. But the beauty of the modern world is you can actually go and inhabit them. 20 years ago, you would have spent your whole life dreaming about them. And I was so happy that you said it was my signature book, because it's still my favorite among my books. Because at that time, I was living in Midtown Manhattan, working on the 25th floor office, 4 blocks from Times Square, writing world affairs stories for Time magazine, pretty much in the job and the life I might have dreamed of as a little boy, and had a lot of time to take holidays, had not a care or responsibility in the world, and surrounded by invigorating, really rich and interesting company. But some part of me felt as if I was only doing justice to one half of the world, and that I was getting a jolt of stimulation and excitement and seeing the exterior world. But there are many things connected with silence and reflection and nothing happening that I wasn't seeing. So I left that job and decided to go and live for a year in a monastery in Kyoto. And you're smiling because you know already what happened, which is my high-minded year in Kyoto lasted exactly a week. I got there and I found that a monastery in Kyoto was dangerously close to the English boarding schools where I spent so much time. It wasn't just sitting on a wooden platform contemplating the moon and writing depthless haiku. It was scrubbing and cleaning things and being out at dawn and cold showers, that whole kind of military monastic thing that we've been trained in. So I bailed out after a week. And my 3rd week there, I went to a temple ceremony in one of the great old Zen temples of Kyoto, Tofukuji, and I found myself next to a young woman. And very quickly, we found ourselves closer and closer. And so my year living in a temple, contemplating silence and solitude as I'd seen it, became in fact a year about seeing her turn her life around. Because when I met her and when I grew close to her, she was married with 2 children, and as fast as her country transformed itself after World War II, she transformed her life in the next few months. When I met her, she'd never been on a plane, she'd never been really outside her hometown of Kyoto, and a few months later, she was an international tour guide, leading even more bewildered Japanese around the globe. And it's an interesting example. So I think the first rule of travel is the minute you arrive somewhere, all your plans go out the window. Something else takes over, something wiser than you, and you see the limitations or insufficiency of your plans. And this is a perfect example. And yet, the sequel, and I'm not spoiling it, I think, too much, is 25 years later now. I've never left Kyoto. I've never left that woman. And we live in a place more monastic than the monastery I checked into. It's a 2-room place in the middle of nowhere. We don't have a printer or a car or a bicycle, or it's so tiny you can't even open the bathroom door. And again, whatever instinct sent me to the monastery was correct, but maybe I wasn't ready for it at that time, and I had to enter the world more, marry a woman, become stepfather to 2 children, and finally, a quarter of a century later, be Japanese enough to really understand what a Japanese monastery is about. Because when I went there, it was only the fantasy of Japanese quiet I was in love with. And now I feel Japan has entered me sufficiently that I'm ready to open the door to what I was looking for then. Right. So those are a few of the things that I see when I look at that cover.
When you went to Japan first, you were a traveler, even though you felt that Japan was someplace you felt instinctually at home.
Yeah.
At what point, or does Japan feel like home now?
It felt like home then. And the reason I went there was that it instantly makes sense to me. And also I thought this is a place whose values I want to learn. I work at my stepdaughter's desk, so it's a tiny space filled with pictures of Brad Pitt and indeed the aforementioned Hello Kitty. I don't have a space of my own. I sleep on a couch in the living room. I have no TV I can understand, no newspapers, no magazines, no, until recently, high-speed internet, no bicycle, no car, no anything. So my whole days are spent within 4 square block radius, really. And it seems like the ultimate luxury. That, you know, happiness or affluence is not a matter of what you have, but what you don't need. And it seems to me as if I have almost anything that I could have wanted, which is why I moved from Midtown Manhattan, where there was more material abundance and plenty than now, but something else missing more invisibly. So every day when I wake up, it seems as if the day lasts 1,000 hours. So I sit down and I write for many hours at this child's desk, and then I can take walks, and then I can sit out in the sun. We have a 3-foot long terrace, so it's the size of this stripe here, but I can sit there eating tangerines, burying myself in long books that I would never have the chance to read if I was in California or somewhere nearer to civilization. Then I play furious 2 hours of ping pong with the local grandmothers, and some of the grandfathers also, and that's been my entree into Japanese society. And then I still have 6 hours left before I have to go to sleep. So somehow or other, it seems the most spacious kind of existence I can imagine. And it's a way of learning about stillness and concentration, which I think are 2 of the Japanese gifts.
Right. I totally understand. And I think that for you especially, given your cosmopolitan background, Japan is a really comfortable place to be in a lot of ways. I mean, you grew up homeless, which I think made you find home in a different way.
Yes.
You define it differently, and you absorb it differently.
No, I think that's true, and part of being at home for me is being a foreigner.
Right.
And I'm comfortable in that sense of displacedness or being an outsider because I was a little boy of Indian origin growing up in England, and then a little boy with Indian skin and an English voice growing up in California from the age of 7. And then from the age of 9, I was going back and forth 6 times a year, as I describe in this book, by myself, between 60s California and a boarding school set up in 1440. You're absolutely right. I think for me, you can imagine, I quickly felt that I didn't fully belong to England, and I couldn't fully claim to belong to California, but really where I was at home was in the movement between them, the combinations between them, the passages in some ways, in all senses, and the fact of commuting. And I don't think that's so interesting, but when I was doing that, I didn't meet many people in that same position. And even though the lights are fairly dim now, when I look across a room like this, I'm guessing 30 or 40% of the people in this room have many, many different cultures inside them, and in some ways are my compatriots because they belong to this realm of the floating home. And they have many, many different places, a culture associated with their parents, and another maybe with their partners, and another with Washington, D.C., and another with the place they dream of. And their whole life is going to be spent bringing all these places together and trying to make a kind of stained glass whole out of them. But home will be a work in progress for them. And at home has less and less to do with a piece of soil and more to do with a piece of soul, exactly as you said, that home is something internal for those of us who aren't rooted in geography. And if your home is internal, you're so right. You can go to a seemingly foreign place like Japan. It will always be foreign, and yet it somehow enriches and deepens the India and the England and the California in me. And it just can be another part of the puzzle that throws light on the other places.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions or thoughts that kept coming into my mind reading your new book, The Man Within My Head, was just this image of you as a 9-year-old traveling solo from California to England to go to school, back to California for vacations. And I just thought, how did that affect you? What do you remember from those flights? What was it like as a 9-year-old to be doing this all the time?
The actual process of travel was exhilarating because if you're 9 years old, and I think it's still the case, you're an unaccompanied minor. So I would remember my parents would drive me down to Los Angeles airport, commit me to the care of usually a very, very kind, solicitous, and quite glamorous Pan Am or TWA cabin attendant. She would take my papers away, so there went my identity. I was already on the way to being a new person, lead me by the hand into the plane and say, Coca-Cola, peanuts, headphones, whatever you want, we will look after you. And I was between the rival authorities of my parents, who were actually very kind, but probably wouldn't have wanted to spoil me too much, and a school where we had to run through cold showers every morning at 6 a.m., and there was a lot of corporal punishment, and older boys were allowed to beat younger boys, in fact, encouraged to do so. And in between, San Quentin and Alcatraz, I was in this promised land where all the cabin attendants were dancing attention and trying to make my life as wonderful as it could be. I remember Raquel Welch, who had just appeared in an animal skin bikini in 10,000 years BC or whatever it was. She was standing right in front of me in the check-in line once. And I used to go back to England in about this time, actually. So it was right after the Academy Awards, and there were always British technicians waving their gold Oscars on the plane, and all kinds of excitements. So I suppose for a child, it was my Dickensian wonderworld. Every child finds his own amusement park, really, out of the world around him. And that was it. And then when I arrived at the other end, and this really induced bad habits in me, I had a choice. I would get there at noon, and kids had to be back in the boarding school at 8, say. So I realized if I went back, I would be the only kid there for 8 hours and the target of every form of abuse from all the teachers who were there looking for some small victim. So I would just put my huge suitcase out on the sculpted chairs in Heathrow and just go to sleep there. And many years later, I remember sometimes when I was a teenager, I would spend day after day after day sleeping in Miami airport. And later, of course, I went to live in Los Angeles airport as an adult, ostensible adult, for 2 weeks. And so it set all kinds of habits loose in me. But I think one of the main ones was being very comfortable in the process of travel, and maybe not so good at settling down in any community, but certainly formed or deformed me for life, I think. And the other thing that instantly I was doing, going back and forth between the 15th century and the 1960s, and between Grateful Dead concerts on the one side and the Lord's Prayer in Latin on the other, was first, I suppose, I always became a bit of a hippie when I was in California and something of a skeptic when I went to England. And then being a crafty little boy, I saw it was much better to do it the other way around. And to be a hippie when I went to England and tell my envious 9-year-old classmates, I just saw the Grateful Dead on Telegraph Avenue, and their eyes grow larger and larger with ill-concealed admiration. And then come back and quote Latin to my startled friends in California. But it was a training, I suppose, in what's always been clearly one of the themes of my writing, which is the way cultures project their longings or their fantasies or their illusions or romances upon the other. And I really did have the distinct sense when I was growing up, most of the little English boys around me had one dream in life, and that was to be a Californian. Because in the 1960s and 1970s, it was the place that represented freedom from the past, long horizons, endless summer. You could make yourself up to be anything you wanted. And so many people I knew in California seemed to long for the sense of continuity and groundedness and order that England still has in spades. And so I saw how each was dreaming of the other. And as you know, when I wrote my first book, this one, I just transplanted it in some ways to the East and the West, and saw how the West's notions of the East collided with the East notions of the West, and as in any love affair, turned into a confounding dance of genuine fascination and illusion, in which each didn't know how much he was in love with the other, and how much with what the other represented, or how much the fancy he projected upon the other. So I suppose it shaped my thinking in those ways, and I've always seeing cultures collide and seeing them think about one another or fail to think about one another has become my home environment. And I sometimes think that so many of the writers I love, let's say they grew up in Kansas, and that is their backdrop and the place that they know in their sleep, the place they know better than the lines on their palm. They know its rituals, its secrets, its pauses, its silences, and will write about that for the rest of their lives. And others have grown up in Bombay, and even if they move to Toronto, say, like the great writer Rohinton Mistry, they're always walking through those back streets that they know by heart in Bombay. And that will be their literary terrain in some ways. So my terrain probably is the process of movement and the process of watching culture circle around one another. That's what I grew up in more than any fixed place.
Nice. When you travel now, are you conscious of seeking something when you go somewhere? Or do you go somewhere and land and just sort of try to absorb the place when you're there?
I suppose I always ask myself a question before I go to a place, but I'm not seeking an answer. I think if it's a good enough question, it'll lead to a better and better and deeper question. And I think the best places are the ones that leave you permanently unsettled. I remember when I used to go to Cuba many years ago, the reason that Cuba never left me, and I couldn't get it out of my head like a song that just keeps on playing and playing, is that I could never get my head around it. I could never make sense of it. It was the saddest place I'd ever seen, the most exuberant, the most disenchanted, the most romantic and idealistic, the most dilapidated in some ways, and the most vibrant in others. And so, because it was this cluster of paradoxes, it refused to settle into my boxed ideas, as it were. And that's the most wonderful thing of all. Because I do think it's a little fatal to seek for anything when you go anywhere, because expectation defeats itself. You probably remember when you walk into a temple in Kyoto, there's an inscription in Japanese that says, "Look beneath your feet," meaning why travel all the way around the world to count the cats in Zanzibar? Whatever you're looking for, you can find wherever you happen to be. I remember, I don't know if I ever told you, a few years ago I went to Tibet. And I took my wife there because she'd never had the chance to go. And we had a wonderful place, and we drove across these 14,000-foot passes, and we went to the Jokang Temple, which is still really the holy epicenter of old Tibet, where you see these people who've walked for 3-4 months just to get there from the furthest reaches of eastern Tibet, sometimes prostrating every step of the way, and their faces are streaked in grime. And in this place, which is just lit by flickering candles, you can barely see their features, but you can see the tears running down them. And they're so moved finally to be in the center of their holy city. So we had a lot of remarkable experiences, as anybody does when he or she goes to Tibet. And then I flew back to California to my mother's house. And of course I was jet-lagged and suffering from reverse culture shock and a little discombobulated, a little sad to be outside Tibet. And I couldn't settle to anything, restless. And finally I just got into my car and I drove 10 minutes up the road from my mother's house. And because I hadn't really settled into my routine, I was seeing it a little as if a foreigner, or as if a sort of jet-lagged, stupefied, altered state kind of creature. And suddenly I noticed that in front of me on one side was the great blue expanse of the Pacific, and on the other side was ridge after ridge of completely untouched mountains, and there were caves with ancient aboriginal, so to speak, indigenous paintings in them. And there was not a trace of human habitation for as far as I could see on either side for 45 minutes as I was driving across the mountains. And I suddenly thought, if I were a Tibetan or a Burmese or a Cuban or somebody from anywhere else, this would seem the most remarkable place in the world. This place, 10 minutes from my mother's home, is as beautiful and transporting and radiant as, maybe more radiant than anything I saw in Tibet. But it needed those new eyes or unsettled eyes, confused eyes, to be able to see it. And every time I come back from a trip, I always say, well, I'm going to look around my hometown as if I were a foreigner. And after about 2 days, that resolve gets forgotten. Yeah, exactly, alas. But if you can do it, then you realize that you don't have to go across the world to find whatever transformation or illumination you're searching.
Right. One of the things you and I have often said is that one of the gifts of travel is that you appreciate your own place better, your home better, your country better. Yeah. Well, Pico, thank you. I mean, one of the great gifts that you give us is that you paint that very sear portrait of the room and the flower in the room. You turn the world into that for us. You make it clear. You make it many layered and rich. And I think you help us appreciate all of the complexities of the world that we go out to and encounter every day and we don't pay attention to. When I read you, I reappreciate them and I re-understand why it's important to live as fully as possible with as much heart and as much mind. I mean, you're a great exemplar of that.
Oh,
so
what beautiful
thank
words.
you very, very much. Thank you for tonight.
Thank you. Thanks so much.